Good morning. Happy Vesak to all of you. Good to see so many people online for the Buddha's birthday. And good morning, Bante Sudaso. And hello, Ella, Gita, Gabriella, Joe from the UK, Jens, who says, good morning, everyone, on this very auspicious day. Good morning, Brant, Bradley, Edward, Ethan, Cam, Geeta, and hello, James, who's bending work rules to watch this. Hello, Belinda, Ryan, Elaine, Richard, good to see you. Key from Australia, Nora, Kyle, good morning, Sally, Rupa, Yasmin, Leo, Ramon, and Liz. Welcome to everyone. So we will, at the top of the live chat, or somewhere at the top of the live chat, since there's been a lot of conversation already happening, there is a link to the chanting book, where on page 3 you can find the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, and that's what we will be chanting this morning. But first, we will take the precepts with Bante, and there's a link on tathagata.org of, let me actually post it again so you can find it more easily, where to take the precepts. All right, and I pass it on to Bante.
So, good morning, friends. As mentioned, we'll start by taking the 8 precepts. So we'll be doing this line by line. I'll chant one line and then you repeat after me. So Ayasoma will be leading the response part of the chanting. So you can follow along with her as she chants the response. And as mentioned, after taking the 8 precepts, then we'll chant the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. If you find the 8 precepts a little bit intimidating, keep in mind it's just for one day. So just for today, on this very blessed day, this very holy and sacred day, for one day we can follow the 8 precepts. And tomorrow you can resume not following the 8 precepts if that's what you want to do, unless you're living here at the monastery, in which case you still follow the 8 precepts every day, no matter what. And of course, some people do take long-term commitments to the 8 precepts. But for today, just take it for one day. So just for this day, to refrain from killing, stealing, sexual activity, telling lies, using intoxicants, eating afternoon, using any kind of entertainment or beautification, and refraining from luxurious bedding. Very simple practices. So please repeat after me, line by line. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa.
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 Buddhang saranang gacchami.
Buddham saranam gacchami.
Dhammang saranang gacchami.
Dhammam saranam gacchami.
Sanghang saranang gacchami.
Sangham saranam gacchami.
Dutiyampi buddhang saranang gacchami.
Dutiyampi buddham saranam gacchami.
Dutiyampi dhammang saranang gacchami.
Dutiyampi dhammam saranam gacchami.
Dutiyampi sanghang saranang gacchami.
Dutiyampi sangham saranam gacchami.
Tatiyampi buddhang saranang gacchami.
Tatiyampi buddham saranam gacchami.
Tatiyampi dhammang saranang gacchami.
Tatiyampi dhammam saranam gacchami.
Tatiyampi sanghang saranang gacchami.
Tatiyampi sangham saranam gacchami.
Panatipata veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
Panatipata veramani sikkhapadam samadhiyami.
Adinnadana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
Adinnadana veramani sikkhapadam samadhiyami.
Abrahmacharya veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
Abrahmacharya veramani sikkhapadam samadhiyami.
Musavada veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
Musavada veramani sikkhapadam samadhiyami.
Surameraya majjapamadatthana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
Surameraya majjapamadattana veramani sikkhapadam samadhiyami.
Vikala bhojana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
Vikala bhojana veramani sikkhapadam samadhiyami.
Nacha gita vadita visukadasana.
Nacha gita vadita visukadasana.
Mala gandha vilepana dharana mandana vibhusanathana.
Mala gandha vilepana dharana mandana vibhusanathana.
Veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
Veramani sikkhapadam samadhiyami.
Uchasayana mahasayana veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyami.
Uchasayana mahasayana veramani sikkhapadam samadhiyami.
Silena sugating yanti, silena bhoga sampada, silena nibbhuting yanti, tasma silang visodhaye.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Okay, very good. So regardless of what you might have done in the past, right now you're a virtuous person. So you can forget about all your past misdeeds. They'll still come back and bite you in the future, don't worry. But for the time being, you can set them aside and focus on your goodness. So right now you've committed to following the 8 precepts for a period of time. So that means right now you have good virtue. Now it's just a matter of protecting it, maintaining it, developing it. So now we can go ahead and chant the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. So this is generally referred to as the first sutta given by the Buddha, and it's not actually the first teaching the Buddha gave, but it's the first recorded sutta that we have. So the Buddha did give some teachings before this sutta, but they're not recorded. So we don't have them in sutta format. We do have some little bits and pieces, but nothing like a full sutta. So this is the first full sutta that we have given by the Buddha. And it lays out the overall framework of everything that he was going to teach for the next 45 years. Everything that he taught over the course of his teaching career as a fully enlightened being. So this is a very important discourse, and it has a lot of very valuable information in it. And it also is a source of faith and joy. So chanting the sutta and recollecting that this was a teaching the Buddha gave shortly after attaining enlightenment. It was a teaching he gave to his first group of disciples, coming from his deep, compassionate wish to help all beings attain awakening. He delivered these teachings for the benefit not just of those 5 disciples, but for all the countless millions and billions of people who would be the heirs of his teachings, the recipient of his teachings over thousands of years. So we'll chant this together. If you're familiar with this sutta and you know what it means, then reflect on its meaning as we chant. If you're not familiar, remember to read it later on in your own language, and instead focus on harmonizing with the sound of the chanting, trying to chant together with the sound of the chanting. So we'll start again with Namo Tassa 3 times, and then we'll recite the sutta together. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Evang me sutang ekang samayang bhagava varanasiyang viharati sipatane migadaye tatra ko bhagava panchavagye bhikkhu amante situve me Bhikkhave anta bhalvajite nanasevita vayo chayam Kame sukhama sukhalikanu yogo Hino gammo potunjaniko anariyo anata sandhito Yo chayang atakila matanu yogo duko anariyo anata sandhito Ete te bhikkhave ubhavante anupagamma majjhima patipada tathagatina visambuddha chakukarani jnanakarani upasamaya bhinyaya sambuddhaya nirvanaya samvatati katama chasa bhikkhave manjjhima patipada tathagatina visambuddha chakukarani jnanakarani upasamaya bhinyaya sambuddhaya nirvanaya samvatati ayameva ariyo arthangiko mago Seyatidam samma ditti samma sankappo samma vaca samma kammanto samma ajivo samma vayamo samma sati samma samadhi ayangkosa Bhikkhave manjjhima ปฏิปดาตถาคเตนะภิสัมพุทธาจักขุการณีญาณการณีอุปสมัยวิญญาณสัมโมดายนิมบานายสังวัตติดังโคภานะเวกเวดุขังอริยสัจจังจาติปิทุกขาจาราปิทุกขามรณังปิทุกขังโสกปริเดวทุกขโดมนัสสุปายาสาปิทุกขอภิเยหิสัมปโยโกทุกขภิเยหิวิปโยโกทุกขยัมภิชังนลปฏิธัมปิทุกขังสันเคเตนะปัญจุปาดานะขันธาทุกขาอิรังโคภานะเบกเวทุกขสมุทัยโยอริยสัจจังยายังทันหาโวโนภเวกานันติราคะสหกทาทัตระทัตราภินันทินิเสยทิดังกามทันหาภวทันหาวิภวทันหาเอดังโคปานะเบกเวทุกขนิโรโดอริยสัจจังโยทัสสะเยวทันหายาเสสะวิราคะนิโรโดจาโกปฏินิสสะโกมุติยนาลโยเวรังโคปานะเบกเวดุขันนิโรธกามินีปฏิปดาอริยสัจจังกายเมวะอริโยวัฏังเกโกมังโกเสยทิรังสัมมาทิฏฐิสัมมาสังกัปปะสัมมาวาจาสัมมากัมมันโตสัมมาชีโวสัมมาวายามโมสัมมาสติสัมมาสมาธิดังดุขังอริยสัจจันติเมเบกเวภูเบอนันุสุเทสุธัมเมสุจักขุงอุดปาริญาณังอุดปาริปัญญาอุดปาริวิญญาอุดปาริอาโลกอุดปาริธัมโคปานิดังดุขังอริยสัจจังปริญเยยันติเมเบกเวภูเบอนันุสุเทสุธัมเมสุจักขุงอุดปาริญาณังอุดปาริปัญญาอุดปาริวิญญาอุดปาริอาโลกอุดปาริธัมโคปานิดังดุขังอริยสัจจังปริญญาตันติเมบิกเวภูเบอนันุสุเทสุธัมเมสุจักขุงอุดปาริญาณังอุดปาริปัญญาอุดปาริวิญญาอุดปาริอาโลกอุดปาริดังดุขัสสมุทัยโยอริยสัจจันติเมเบกเวภูเบอนันุสุเตสุธัมเมสุจักขุงอุดปาริญาณังอุดปาริปัญญาอุดปาริวิญญาอุดปาริอาโลกอุดปาริธัมโคปานิดังดุขัสสมุทัยโยอริยสัจจังปะหาธัมปันติเมเบกเวภูเบอนันุสุเทสุธัมเมสุจักขุงอุดปาริญาณังอุดปาริปัญญาอุดปาริวิญญาอุดปาริอาโลกอุดปาริธัมโคปานิดังดุขัสสมุทัยโยอริยสัจจังปะหินันติเมเบกเวภูเบอนันุสุเทสุธัมเมสุจักขุงอุดปาริญาณังอุดปา ริปัญญาอุรปาริวิญญาอุรปาริอาโลโกอุรปาริรังดุกนิโรโดอริยสัจฉันติเมภิกขเวบุมเบยานานุสุเทสุธัมเมสุจักขุงอุรปาริญาณังอุรปาริปัญญาอุรปาริวิญญาอุรปาริอาโลโกอุรปาริธังโกภาริรังดุกนิโรโดอริยสัจจังสัจฉิกาทาบันติเมภิกขเวปุมเบยานุสุเทสุธัมเมสุจักขุงอุรปาริญาณังอุรปาริปัญญาอุรปาริวิญญาอุรปาริอาโลโกอุรปาริธังโกภาริรังดุกนิโรโดอริยสัจจังสัจฉิกทันติเมภิกขเวบุมเบยานานุสุเทสุธัมเมสุจักขุงอุรปาริญาณังอุรปาริปัญญาอุรปาริวิญญาอุรปาริอาโลโกอุรปาริรังดุกนิโรธกามินีปฏิปดาอริยสัจฉันติเมภิกขเวบุมเบอานานุสุเตสุธัมเมสุจักขุงอุรปาริญาณังอุรปาริปัญญาอุรปาริวิญญาอุรปาริอาโลโกอุรปาริธังโฆภาริรังดุกนิโรธกามินีปฏิปดาอริยสัจจังภาเวทาบันติเมภิกขเวบุมเบอานานุสุเทสุธัมเมสุจักขุงอุรปาริญาณังอุรปาริปัญญาอุรปาริวิญญาอุรปาริอาโลโกอุรปาริธังโฆภาริรังดุกนิโรธกามินีปฏิปดาอริยสัจจังภาวิตันติเมภิกขเวปุมเบยานานุสุเทสุธัมเมสุจักขุงอุรปาริญาณังอุรปาริปัญญาอุรปาริวิญญาอุรปาริอาโลโกอุรปาริอาวคิวันชเมภิกขเวยเมสุจัตุสุอริยสัจเจสุเอวันติปาริวัตตังนุอาดาสาคารังยะถาภูตังญาณทัสสนังนะสุวิสุทธังอโหสิเนวตามาหังภิกขเวสเดวะเคโลเกสมาระเคสบรหมเกสัสมณบรหมณิยาปัจจายสเดวมนุสสายอนุตตรังสัมมาสัมโพธิงอภิสัมพุทโธปัจฉัญญาสิงยโตจะโกเมภิกขเวยเมสุจตุสุวริยสัจเจสุเอวันติปาริวัตตังดุอาดาสาคารังยะถาภูตังญาณทัสสนังสุวิสุทธังอโหสิยถาหังภิกขเวสเดวะเคโลเกสมาระเคสบรหมเกสัสมณบรหมณิยาปัจจายสเดวมนุสสายอนุตตรังสัมมาสัมโพธิอภิสัมพุทโธภาชัญญาสิงญาณัญจปนเมตตาสนังอุรปาริยภุปปาเมวิมุตติยมันติมาจาตินาติตานิโกนาภโวติธัมมโวชะภะคะวะอัตตมนะ Panchavagiya Bhikkhu Bhagavato Bhasitang Abhinandong Imasmin cha Panaveya Karanasmin Vanyamane Ayasmato Kondanya Savirajam Vitamalang Dhamma Chakhung Murapariyan Kinche Samudaya Dhammang Sabandhang Nirodha Dhammanti Bhavati Te Cha Bhagavata Dhamma Chake Bhumma Deva Sannamanu Savesu Etam Bhagavata Varanasiyam Gisipatane Migadaye Anutarang Dhammachakam Bhavati Tanga Pativatiyam Samanena Va Brahmanena Va Devena Va Marena Va Brahmana Va Kena Chiva Lokasmin Bhumanam Devanam Sandam Sutva Chatum Deva Sadamanu Save Sum Chatum Maharajikanam Devanam Sadam Sutva Davatim Sa Deva Sadamanu Save Sum Davatim Sanam Devanam Sadam Sutva Yama Deva Sannamanu Save Sum Yamanam Devanam Saddam Sutva Dusita Deva Sannamanu Save Sum Dusitanam Devanam Saddam Sutva Nimmanarati Deva Saddamanu Save Sum Nimmanaratinam Devanam Saddam Sutva Bharanim Mitavasavati Deva Saddamanu Save Sum Bharanim Mitavasavati Nam Devanam Saddam Sutva Brahmakayika Deva Saddamanu Save Sum Etam Bhagavata Varanasiyam Isipatane Migadaye Anuttaram Dhammachakam Bhavati Tanga Pativatiyam Samanena Va Brahmanena Va Devena Va Marena Va Brahmana Va Kena Chiva Lokasmin Ti Hatena Kanena Tena Muhut Tena Yava Brahma Loka Saddo Ambungati Ayancha Dasa Sahasi Lokanatu Sankampi Sampakampi Sampavedi Appamano Chaolaro Obaso Loke Paturaho Siyate Kammeva Devana Devanubhavam Gatako Bhagava Udanam Udane Siyanya Sivatabho Kondanyo Anya Sivatabho Kondanyo Tididang Ayasmato Kondanya Sa Anya Kondanyo Tuleva Namang Ahositi Dhamma Chakapavatana Sutang Netitam. All right. So at this time, we've taken the 8 precepts. We've recited the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. So hopefully your mind is filled with brightness and joy, filled with faith and confidence. This feeling of connection with the Buddha, this feeling of being in the lineage of the Buddha, of being part of the family of the Buddha. So one of the lovely things when one takes ordination as a monastic. And part of the ceremony is that one is called a child of the Buddha. So if you're a male, you're called a son of the Buddha. If you're a female, you're called a daughter of the Buddha. So there's this idea that when we enter fully into the Buddhist path, we become part of the family of the Buddha, the lineage of the Buddha. So there's this feeling of strong, intimate connection with the Buddha. And we can also tap into that every time that we read the suttas or chant from the suttas, every time that we take precepts, every time that we do meditation practice, every time that we engage in any act of kindness or generosity, every time that we reflect on the meaning of the Dhamma, we can always bring to mind that sense of connection with the Buddha, that sense of being part of the family of the enlightened ones, part of the lineage of the enlightened ones. So today is Vesak Day, and apparently in some places it's been Vesak for 2 days now. So one of the lovely things about having many different versions of the Buddhist calendar is that you get to do the same holiday several days in a row. So Vesak Day, according to some calendars, is today. And Vesak is the day which, in all Buddhist traditions, it celebrates the birth of the Buddha. And in the Theravada tradition, it also celebrates his enlightenment and his passing away. So first, fixating on the birth of the Buddha. So why is this important? Well, in order to understand why the birth of the Buddha is important, it's necessary to have some sense as to what he was doing before that. So the Buddha, the story goes, many, many, many eons ago, there was a person who was then not a Buddha, was not even a bodhisattva. He was just an ordinary person. And he met a Buddha. And he was so awed by the majestic wisdom and compassion of that Buddha that he met, that he vowed to someday be like that Buddha. He vowed to someday become a Buddha as well. And then this being spent countless lifetimes, so hundreds and hundreds of lifetimes, possibly thousands of lifetimes, millions of lifetimes. We don't know exactly how many. He spent many, many, many lifetimes in many different forms. So sometimes as a human, sometimes as an animal, sometimes as a deva, sometimes in the hell realms, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes neither. So many different forms of existence. And in these different forms of existence, this being was trying to cultivate the necessary conditions to become a Buddha. So it's quite challenging to become a Buddha, to become a fully enlightened Buddha at a time when Buddhism is not known, to attain it without direct instruction, and to have the fully developed abilities to teach others and guide them on the path to awakening. That all requires extremely precise conditions. Very precise karma must be created in order for it to be possible to become a Sammasambuddha. So this being spent countless lifetimes in many, many different forms of existence, carefully cultivating the qualities that would eventually allow that person to become a Sammasambuddha. And some of these are recorded in the Jataka tales, and some of the Jataka tales are from the suttas, and some are from who knows where, and some are almost certainly from the Buddha, and others are of doubtful origin. That's all kind of beside the point. Because the point of the Jataka tales is rather to give some image as to what it might be like, or what it can be like to spend all these countless lifetimes cultivating the qualities of wisdom and compassion, cultivating the specific karmic conditions that allow one to be a Sammasambuddha. And in these various versions of the Jataka tales, you can see the struggles and the challenges and the difficulties that this aspiring bodhisattva went through in trying to develop the qualities that would eventually allow them to become a Sammasambuddha. So this is to help bring up in us, first off, a sense of gratitude towards the Buddha, who did struggle for so many lifetimes. For so incredibly long, he struggled and struggled to develop the qualities necessary so that he could start the dispensation, so that we could benefit from it. And he didn't need to do any of these things. He didn't have to. He chose to. He chose to out of compassion for all the suffering beings in the world, out of compassion for us, here and now, who are the recipients of his teachings, the heirs of the Dhamma. Reflecting on the long path of the Bodhisattva, so all those countless lifetimes that he spent cultivating the qualities and conditions to be a Sammasambuddha, also helps give us a sense of the rarity and specialness of a Sammasambuddha. So it's easy to take it for granted these days because we've always had it. For as long as we can remember, we've had access to the teachings of the Buddha. And when I was very young, of course, I didn't know much about it, but it was there. If I had wanted to know, I could have gone to the library or gone on the internet and found out. And when I did get interested at the age of 17, when I did get interested in learning more about Buddhism, it was quite easy. You could just go online and find the teachings of the Buddha. It was quite easy. So it's easy to take it for granted, to just be like, oh yeah, we've got Buddhism. We also have got pizza. We've got lots of good things. And to kind of overlook the rarity and specialness of it. In the Mahayana tradition, there's often a short chant that's done before any study session, any Dhamma talk, any Sutta discussion, anything of any sort that's study related or Dharma related. They often do this little chant, which is just saying, this precious Dhamma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million eons. Having encountered it, I vow to understand its meaning. So it's this very simple reminder that the Dhamma is something very rare, very special. That to live in a time when a Buddha has come into being and has delivered their teachings, and when those teachings are available to us, and when we're capable of understanding them, and when we have the aspiration and will to understand them, and to practice them, and to live them, that's all very rare. That happens very, very rarely. So a Sammasambuddha arising in the world in the first place is a very rare event. It's uncommon. So to be born at the time when the Buddha's teachings are available is not common in the first place. But then if we are born in that time, then odds are extremely likely that we'll be born as an animal or as an insect, or that we'll be in one of the hell realms. Or we might be in one of the very high heavens. So these are all realms where one would not have access to the Buddha's teachings. So the only people who have access to a Buddha's teachings are humans and the lower categories of devas. Nobody else does. There's lots and lots of beings who have been alive for the last 2,500 years who did not have access to the Buddha's teachings. And even among humans, many, many beings over the last 2,500 years have not had access to the teachings. Even today, many, many humans do not have access to these teachings. So really bringing up a sense of the specialness and rarity, the marvelous opportunity that we have, the marvelous opportunity that was created through the monumental dedication and perseverance of the Bodhisattva, who eventually became Gautama Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha. So remembering that. So if we're going to talk about the birth of the Buddha, it's necessary to talk about everything he did before that birth. Because that's actually the vast majority of the story of the Buddha, is everything that he did in order to create the conditions to become a Buddha in the first place. Then the birth of the Buddha. And there's various interesting stories, both from the suttas and from later texts, about particular details of the birth of the Buddha, various miraculous things that happened. Some of the more tame ones have to do with groups of devas coming and rejoicing that the Bodhisattva was born. And I'm not going to go into that because it's really beside the point. Not really terribly relevant. What is particularly relevant, though, is that this being was born, and for the first 35 years, this being had no idea whatsoever that he was bound to become a Buddha. For the first 35 years, this being was living a normal human life, relatively normal human life. He was quite wealthy, and he was a member of a ruling family. So he was living a pretty privileged life, pretty pleasant life, all the good things and pleasant things that one could wish for in ancient India. So he didn't have flush toilets and he didn't have Neapolitan pizza, but he did have lots of other nice things. So he's living a pretty nice life, a pretty good life, but he was living like a pretty ordinary person for the most part, doing ordinary person things. What was different, though, was that he was not particularly satisfied with any of it. And he had a sense that there was something more important, something greater. He didn't know what it was, but there was a sense that there was something more important. There was something more meaningful, rather than just inheriting his father's properties and taking over, ruling the territory and producing some children and dying a ripe old age in his palace. He had a feeling there was something more important to life, something more meaningful. And he also had a deep sense of discontent, a deep sense of dissatisfaction. So eventually, as the inherently unsatisfying nature of human life became painfully clear to him, and this story that we commonly hear is the story of the four heavenly messengers. That the Bodhisattva, so at this time, the young man named Siddhartha Gautama, so the Bodhisattva, Siddhartha, saw an old person, someone who was very old and decrepit, barely able to walk, very frail and weak. He saw a sick person, someone who was terribly severely ill, so sick they couldn't even get up. And he saw a dead body. And he saw a monk. So these are the four heavenly messengers, as we call them. And we call them that because these were the four things which, when he reflected upon them, the Bodhisattva realized the hollowness and meaninglessness of living an ordinary life. And he saw the importance of taking on a spiritual life. And a lot of us may have seen these sorts of things. We're aware of old age, sickness, and death, and we're aware of the existence of monks, and yet we continue to live an ordinary life. Well, keep in mind that the Bodhisattva Siddhartha had spent countless lifetimes developing the conditions to become a Sammasambuddha. So it also meant that his mind was already inclining strongly towards renunciation. It was already inclining strongly towards non-attachment. It was already inclining strongly towards disenchantment and dispassion. So when he encountered these relatively ordinary facts about human life, it had a very strong impact on him. And it woke him up to the fact that there is something more important for him to do. And when he saw the monk the symbol of spiritual practice, then he recognized that that was what he was meant to do. He recognized that that was his path, that that was what he should be doing with his life, what he should be doing with his time. So at the age of 35, is that correct? No, 27. 27, 28, 27, 29, 29, at the age of 29. Okay. So at the age of 29, the Buddha to be, the Bodhisattva Siddhartha, set out to become a monk. And in those days, it was a lot easier. You just went out in the forest and put on a brown robe and you were a monk. These days, you have to go through an ordination ceremony. But in his time, it was really easy. So he became a monk and he practiced various kinds of spiritual practices. And eventually, through his incredible perseverance, again, building upon all the wisdom and compassion he had developed over countless lifetimes. This is really important. So sometimes people talk about the Buddha as though he was an ordinary human being. That's not quite true. He was a human being in his final life, not in many of the ones before that, but in his final life, he was in fact a human being, but he was not ordinary. He had spent countless lifetimes building up an incredible momentum and power of spiritual qualities and perfections, an incredible amount of wisdom and compassion that had already brought him to the brink of awakening. He was already a hair's breadth away from enlightenment when he was born. He didn't need to do much more. But because it's so incredibly difficult to attain enlightenment on your own without instruction, it took him 6 years of dedicated spiritual practice before he attained full enlightenment. So at the age of 35, he attained full enlightenment and he started teaching. So actually, initially, he sat under the Bodhi tree for several days, reflecting on what he had realized and just blissing out. And also having some interesting conversations with devas, which are recorded elsewhere in the Pali Canon, mostly in the Khuddaka Nikaya and also a little bit in the Samyutta Nikaya and a little bit in the Vinaya. So there's some recordings of some of these interesting things that the Buddha reflected on and thought about and discussed with devas shortly after attaining enlightenment. And in the Mahayana tradition, they actually say that just after the Buddha attained enlightenment, he gave an extremely long and very profound teaching to the devas, which is what became the Avatamsaka Sutra. Whether that's true or not is, again, completely beside the point, because it's a really marvelous text if you ever have the time to read it. It's very long, but very interesting. And that's said to be a teaching the Buddha gave to the devas right after attaining enlightenment. In the Pali Suttas, we have a number of very short teachings that he gave to devas shortly after attaining enlightenment. Then eventually he decided, at the behest of one of these devas, he went out to teach his 5 former companions, so 5 people who he'd been practicing with before attaining enlightenment. And on the road, he met a Brahmin who saw the magnificence of the Buddha, asked him who his teacher was, what sort of Dhamma he was practicing, what lineage he was in, and so on. And the Buddha replied that he has no teacher and he has no lineage. And in a world of the blind, he is the only one who can see. And he said, I go now to beat the drum of the deathless. And the Brahmin was like, whatever, dude, and walked away. So that was actually the very first recorded teaching the Buddha gave to a human being. So we say the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta is the first sutta, but once again, that's not exactly accurate. We have the teachings he gave to the devas shortly after attaining enlightenment. And then we have this short teaching that he gave to the Brahmin he met on the road, which was thoroughly unsuccessful in terms of having any positive impact on that particular Brahmin. Then we have him going to the 5 disciples and teaching them the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, in which he lays out the 4 Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, and a way of practicing with the 4 Noble Truths, a way of contemplating and examining them in our daily life. And as he was giving this instruction, then one of those disciples clearly saw the truth of impermanence, clearly saw for himself anicca, that all things are impermanent and insubstantial, and therefore impersonal. So one of his disciples attained the first stage of awakening while listening to the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. So this is also one reason why it's considered so important, is that it was the first time that this newly awakened Buddha was able to bring another person onto the path of awakening. Then after that, we have many, many other suttas, of course, and the Buddha eventually led countless people to full enlightenment and established the dispensation, which has carried the teachings forward for 2,500 years to reach us today. So it's really important to keep this in mind, to keep in mind what Buddhism is, to keep in mind who the Buddha is, what the Buddha is, to keep in mind how rare and special and marvelous and sacred the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha are. To keep in mind that this is not just some kind of self-help manual. It's actually something unbelievably profound, which lays bare a path to directly experiencing the truth of absolute reality, directly experiencing the true nature of the universe, and to completely purifying our minds so that we can cultivate the same wisdom and compassion that the Buddha cultivated, so we can reach the same enlightenment that he reached, so we can follow in his footsteps. So I think that's all I have to say for today. So please, for the rest of the day, remember the Buddha. Remember him with gratitude and awe, and vow to be like him. And this is a Vesak day well spent. So I think I'll leave it there. If you have any questions or comments, please type them in the YouTube live chat, and I'll go ahead and address them at this time.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you, Bhante. So James, we're going to take the precepts again this evening at 7:30, so you're all right. And Marielle is asking, does the Buddha detail some of his previous lives in the suttas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I forget the number off the top of my head, but there's about 50 or so which are from the suttas. Then there's another 500 or so which are apocryphal from the Pali tradition. And then the Mahayana tradition also has a few hundred more, which are also mostly apocryphal. Yeah.
And Sally is asking, I thought it's his destiny that he's going to become a Buddha.
Depends on what you mean by destiny. If by destiny you mean something which absolutely must happen, well, that gets into some somewhat sticky territory. Rather, it's that he created the conditions necessary for him to become a Sammasambuddha. So over the course of many, many, many lifetimes, he made his own destiny. Over many, many lifetimes, he made all the necessary conditions to become a Sammasambuddha. But it wasn't guaranteed. Up until the moment that he attained enlightenment, he could have done something else. But he had spent so long creating the conditions necessary for that to happen that it was extraordinarily likely but it's not a guarantee until it actually happens.
And Marielle is saying, but it wasn't a Buddhist monk, the monk he encountered, right? Because in this eon, Siddhartha was the one that brought back the knowledge of the Buddha, right?
That's correct. The monk that he saw when he was 29, according to May, our resident, 29. I sometimes get the numbers a little bit mixed up. 25? Now she's saying 25. He became Buddha at 35. So 29 was when he left the palace. Okay, so May says 29. Yeah, so the monk he saw was not a Buddhist monk. The monk that he saw at the age of 29 couldn't have been Buddhist because there were no Buddhists. So it was a monk of some sort, but we don't know what kind. So they were practicing some other kind of spiritual practice. In ancient India at the time, there were many, many different religious and spiritual traditions and many different monastic orders following various kinds of practices. And throughout the suttas, the Buddha interacts with quite a number of them and debates with many of them, and also thoroughly dismantles and demolishes their belief systems for the most part. Okay.
Right, and that was the last question. But there are lots of friends who are very happy that this is happening and saying that Robin is saying, thank you so much for organizing this. Sad to not join Vesak festivities in person, but blessed to join the virtual Sangha. Yes, it's so great that there's so many monasteries, including ours, who are tuning in online. So we have pretty much every monastery in the world, I think, is doing a virtual Vesak. So it's quite beautiful and lovely. So the whole day you can actually tune in online and chant with monastics all over the world. So from the United States all the way to Sri Lanka, to Thailand, Australia, everywhere. You pick it. They're there. And good to see you, Andre and Mohammed. Welcome. Come. Very good to see you all. So if you have any questions or thoughts that you would like to share with Bante, you have an opportunity to do so now. Otherwise, we will be meeting again this evening at 7:30 p.m. We will take, there will be another opportunity to take the precepts and go for refuge as soon as we start, for those who have missed it for either work reasons or other different, perhaps, how do you say it? Time zone issues. So you'll have the opportunity to do that 7:30. And we have actually a few comments coming. Oh, Denise, how great to see you. And Masum, hello. Oh, good friends. Denise is saying, good morning, Venerable. Siddhartha left behind his wife and child. How can we understand that seemingly unwholesome action?
So I get this question a lot. So I think actually I answered this fairly recently. Yeah, anyway, I get this question a lot. So first off, it wasn't an unwholesome act. One of the ways that this is commonly explained is through the metaphor of the hero's journey. So let's take this as a slightly different angle. Let's imagine that you had a spouse and a child, and all three of you, your spouse, and your child, you all had a terrible, deadly illness. You all had an illness which meant that you would suffer terribly for years and then die a horrible death. And you heard that there was a treatment, there was a cure for this illness, but that in order to get the cure, you would have to leave your spouse and child behind for a period of time and go on a long, difficult journey in order to get the cure. But that once you got it, you would be able to cure not only yourself and your spouse and your child, but thousands and millions of other people as well, what would you do? Would you set out in search of that cure? Would you go out and get the cure that would cure not just your spouse and your child and yourself, but also millions of other people? Or would you sit at home and die a horrible, painful, miserable death along with your spouse and child? What would you do? Naturally, you would set out and go off and get the medicine, of course. The natural choice. So that's what the Buddha did. He wasn't abandoning his wife and child. He was setting out in order to find the only thing that would really bring them happiness, as well as countless other beings. And actually, after he attained enlightenment, very shortly after he attained enlightenment, he went back and he taught the Dhamma to them. And they both became monastics and they both became fully enlightened. So he did not abandon them. In fact, he did the absolute best thing for them he possibly could have. And that just meant that he had to be apart from them for a few years, which is really not such a big deal. That's one way of relating to that particular part of the Buddha's life.
And Mark is asking, you mentioned the debates that the Buddha had with other traditions/spiritual paths. Could you indicate some Pali suttas that these take place in?
Send an email and I can give you some references. But there's countless examples. Countless examples. The Majjhima Nikaya is littered with them. The Digha Nikaya also has many, many. There's no shortage. If you read the suttas, you'll find no end of suttas like this. Yeah. And it's interesting, by the way, because there was a very wide range of different belief systems. So some of the belief systems at the time believed in karma and some did not. Some believed in rebirth and some did not. Some believed in heavens and hells and some did not. Some believed that spiritual practice was possible and others believed it was not. Some believed in free will, some believed in determinism. There was an incredible range of different viewpoints and opinions. So these days, sometimes people say that the Buddha just spoke about karma and rebirth because that's what everyone believed in the time. But this is totally untrue. There was an incredible variety of different opinions. So the Buddha, by teaching the Dhamma, was making a distinct statement. In that sea of different opinions, he was making a distinct statement. Okay.
Thank you. And Masum is saying that she cannot wait to visit Empty Cloud and see both of you soon. Same here. Hopefully this pandemic will be over soon-ish. We'll see what happens. And Mariana says, would Buddhism consider the people who practice other traditions/spiritual paths in a sort of wholesome way on the path to enlightenment?
Well, it depends on what they're doing. If someone's developing wholesome qualities, then that's part of the path. If they're developing unwholesome qualities, then that's not part of the path. So it depends on what they're doing. Yeah, so there's no straightforward answer to that.
Yeah, she makes a comment. The person who purposely intends to become more kind must be on the path, even if it is through delusion. I mean, even a person who practices Buddhism will have delusions, just other types.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody is developing wholesome qualities through their spiritual practice, then that can help them progress towards awakening. Yeah. It's not a guarantee, of course, but it can help.
And Hockney is saying, what do you think about Mahayana tradition?
I think it's great.
All right, well, that was the last question, so maybe we can end it with have a great
Okay.
have a great tradition, whether it's Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana,
Or some mixture thereof.
Yeah, lots of mixes.
So please spend the day thinking about the Buddha and practicing in line with his teachings. And we'll see you again this evening.
And yes, Ki is actually reminding that Bhante is giving a talk on Mahayana Bodhisattva path and how it relates to the Arahant path on Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. So we meet every 8 a.m. every day at 8 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. New York City time. So you're welcome to log in also the other days and come and practice Dharma with us. But this evening in particular, there will be the second part of our Vesak celebration. And tomorrow morning, we'll have a special Sutta study with Bhante Sudaso on the Ratana Sutta. So he will go through the great qualities of the Buddha. And this evening, we'll also do Buddhanussati meditation and recollecting the great qualities of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And then tomorrow evening, there will be monk chat. So you can bring all your Dhamma questions and tune in at 7:30 p.m. and ask them to myself and Bhante, and we'll try and do our best to answer them. And then this weekend, we'll have the last 2 day longs on the 4 Satipatthanas. So lots of great stuff. Oh, last question. Sally says, when Bhante said we live like Buddha today, I didn't think like that, because if someone's goal is not to attain Buddhahood.
It depends on what your goal is. If you want to be an Arhat, well, then live like an Arhat. If you want to be a Buddha, well, then live like a Buddha. And actually, whichever goal you have, you'll wind up living in pretty much the same way anyway.
Right. And that's the end for this morning. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May we all attain awakening, as Gita says. And see you in a couple of hours, and have a great day. Happy Vesak!